The Dean Martin Show, NBC Studios, Burbank, California. October 1968. The hallway smelled like cigarette smoke and hairspray. Two worlds were about to share the same stage, and nobody in that building fully understood what that meant yet. Dean Martin had been doing this show for 2 years. Every Thursday night, same formula. A joke here, a guest there, a song in the middle, a scotch that may or may not have been water. The audience loved it. Sponsors loved it. NBC loved it. Dean loved it because it required almost nothing from him emotionally. He showed up. He smiled. He sang. He went home. Tonight was supposed to be no different. Marvin Gaye was the guest. 30 years old, fresh off one of the biggest Motown singles of the decade. Safe booking, recognizable name. The kind of guest who fills the second half of the show without complicating the first half. The producers had given Marvin a list. 3 songs, all approved, all safe. Ain't that peculiar? How sweet it is. Maybe I heard it through the grapevine if there was time. Crowd pleasers, radio staples. The kind of songs that made people tap their feet and forget about the news. The news in October 1968 was not something people wanted to remember. Martin Luther King had been shot 6 months earlier. Robert Kennedy 2 months after that. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago had turned into a televised riot. Young men were coming home from Vietnam in boxes, or not coming home at all. The cities were burning. The country was cracking down the middle, and nobody in power seemed to know what to do about any of it. Marvin knew, or at least Marvin felt it. He felt everything in those years, too deeply, too loudly, in a way that made sleeping difficult and recording sessions run until 4 in the morning. His brother Frankie had enlisted believing in something. He came back believing in almost nothing. Marvin would sit across from him at dinner and look into his eyes and see a man who had been somewhere that left marks you couldn't explain to someone who wasn't there. Marvin was trying to find those words. He hadn't found them yet, but he was close. Backstage, 40 minutes before taping, the segment producer found Marvin in his dressing room. Standard pre-show check. Everything good? Need anything? Song list confirmed? Marvin looked at the list. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just looked at it, like he was reading something that had been written in a language he didn't quite speak anymore. Yeah, he finally said. We're good. The producer left. Marvin set the list on the counter and didn't look at it again. Dean Martin was 2 doors down, jacket already on, drink already poured, going over nothing because Dean never went over anything. Preparation was for people who were nervous. Dean was not nervous. He hadn't been genuinely nervous on a stage since before Jerry Lewis, and even then, he wasn't sure it counted. A knock. His assistant. Mr. Martin, they're ready for the Marvin Gaye introduction. They'd like you to bring him out and do a quick song together. Real casual, just to warm the room. Dean nodded. What song? They're thinking Grapevine. He knows it, you know it, the audience knows it. Sure. Dean finished his drink, set down the glass. Let's go. This is where the story really starts. When Dean walked out onto that stage and the crowd applauded and the lights came up warm and yellow the way they always did, and he smiled that effortless smile and said, Ladies and gentlemen, one of the finest voices in the business today, Mr. Marvin Gaye. He had no idea what he just invited into the room. Marvin walked out in a dark suit, calm, unhurried. He waved to the audience and they cheered because they knew his songs and they were ready to hear one. The band was already set. The arrangement was ready. Everybody in that room knew what was supposed to happen next. Dean gestured toward the microphone at center stage. The classic move. Here it is, it's yours. Marvin walked to it. He put his hand on the stand, not gripping it, just resting his fingers there, lightly like he was checking the temperature of something, and then he stopped. He didn't start singing. He didn't look at the band. He stood there with his eyes cast slightly downward, almost like he was listening to something no one else in the room could hear. His jaw was set. His breathing was slow. The band held their positions, waiting for the cue. 3 seconds passed, then 5, then 8. The audience shifted. A few people exchanged glances. Dean, standing just off to the side, tilted his head the smallest fraction. Then Marvin looked up. Not at the audience, not at the cameras pointing at him from 3 angles. He looked directly at Dean Martin. And what Dean saw in that look was not a performer warming up to entertain. It was something heavier, a man who had been holding something for a long time and had run out of places to put it. Marvin turned back to the microphone. He raised one hand slowly toward the band. They stopped. All of them, at once, instruments down. The room went completely quiet, and then Marvin sang. No intro, no arrangement, no chord underneath him, nothing to lean on. Just his voice, alone in that studio, going up into the lights and out through the speakers and into every corner of the room. What he sang wasn't from the list. It wasn't grapevine. It wasn't anything the producers had approved or the sponsors had seen or the network executives had cleared. It was something he'd been building in pieces for months, in notebooks, in the margins of session sheets, at the piano at 2 in the morning when he couldn't sleep. It didn't have a finished title yet. It barely had a finished form yet. But the feeling was complete. He sang about brothers, about what it meant to send young men somewhere they didn't choose to go, about mothers who waited by phones, about a country that kept asking for sacrifice without asking itself the harder question. What for and for whom, and at what point does love have to be louder than all of it? The words were simple, almost uncomfortably simple, but the voice carrying them made the simplicity feel earned, not naive. Like someone had taken a very complicated thing and finally found the sentence that got it exactly right. Nobody in that studio moved. Dean Martin stood with his hands at his sides and watched. 44 years old. He'd been on more stages than he could count. He'd stood next to Sinatra, next to Sammy, next to every major act of 2 decades. He knew what a performance looked like. He could tell from 10 feet away when someone was doing their job and when someone was doing something else entirely. This was something else entirely. When the last note finished, it didn't resolve cleanly. It just ended, the way things end when they're true. Without a bow, without a button, without asking for applause. The silence held for 1 full second. Then the audience started clapping. Slowly at first, the way people applaud when they're not sure what they just saw, but they know they can't sit still for it. Then building, then fully on their feet. Marvin stepped back from the microphone. He looked at Dean. Something passed between them. Not warmth exactly. More like recognition. The way 2 people look at each other when one of them just said the thing the other one had been quietly thinking about without being able to say it. Dean walked to the microphone, put his arm briefly around Marvin's shoulder, said one thing to the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, that's Marvin Gaye. No joke, no pivot, no segue to the next sponsor. Just that. The producers in the booth were already on the phone. The segment had gone off script in a way that was going to require some conversations before the broadcast date. Nobody was happy about the conversations that were coming, and they all knew it. But backstage, 20 minutes later, Dean Martin found Marvin in the hallway. He wasn't there to deliver a message from the network. He wasn't there to play the older man telling the younger one how the business worked. He was there the way someone stops you in a hallway when they have something to say and they want to say it directly. That wasn't what they booked, Dean said. He wasn't angry. He said it the way you state a fact you already know both people know. No, Marvin said. It wasn't. Dean pulled out a cigarette. Let a moment pass. You've been carrying that for a while. Not a question. Marvin nodded. My brother came back from Vietnam. Doesn't talk much anymore. Just sits by the window and looks at things. Dean didn't offer sympathy in the television sense. He didn't say he was sorry or that he could imagine. He just nodded, slowly, the way a man nods when he's old enough to know that some things deserve silence more than they deserve a response. They're going to push back on tonight, Dean said. I know. Motown's going to have thoughts. Barry's not going to love it. I know that too. Dean smoked, looked at the floor, then looked at Marvin. You finished that song, he said. That was the conversation. He dropped the cigarette, pressed it out with his shoe, and walked back toward his dressing room. Marvin stood in the hallway alone. It was the kind of alone he was used to. The space between the moment when the music stopped and the moment when everything else started back up again. Around him, the studio was already resuming its business. Crew voices, equipment rolling, the machine of television continuing forward whether or not something real had just happened inside it. Something real had just happened inside it. 3 years later, in May 1971, What's Going On was released to the world. Every music critic in America reached for words and found that none of them were quite large enough. They wrote about social commentary and the soul tradition and a pivotal turn in the history of American music. They were right about all of it. None of them wrote about a Thursday night in Burbank in October 1968, when a man put his hand on a microphone and paused. When a band stopped playing because a single raised hand asked them to. When 2,000 watts of studio light fell on someone who had decided in that moment that doing what he was supposed to do was no longer something he was willing to do. Dean Martin never told that story publicly. He wasn't the kind of man who narrated other people's moments. But in 1973, a journalist asked him, almost as a side note, if there was any artist in the last 5 years who had genuinely surprised him. Dean thought about it. Marvin Gaye, he said, on my show. He walked up to a microphone and chose not to do what he was supposed to do. Most people in this business spend their entire careers doing exactly what they're supposed to do. He paused for a second. I respected that. The journalist wrote it down. That was the whole answer. Everything compressed into 2 sentences by a man who didn't waste words. He chose not to do what he was supposed to do. There's a version of that night that's easier to imagine. The clean one, where Marvin sings Grapevine, the audience goes home happy, and history doesn't tilt by a single degree. It almost happened that way. He had the list. He knew the songs. He could have sung them in his sleep. Instead, he stood in front of a live camera in Burbank, California, raised his hand, stopped the music, and told the truth without a net underneath him.